The recording chamber felt cold despite the perfect temperature control. Commander Zethkar shifted his massive frame in the specially designed chair, his forearms crossed tightly across his scarred chest. The Vorthic warrior had avoided this moment for 30 years, but time was running out and the truth needed to be told. Dr. Villana checked her recording equipment one final time. The elegant Altarian had been pursuing this interview since she took over the Galactic Historical Archive 5 years ago. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow in the soft chamber lighting as she prepared to capture what might be the most important testimony in galactic history. "Commander, you understand this session is completely voluntary," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality typical of her species. "You may stop at any time or refuse to answer any questions." Zethkar's deep rumble of laughter held no humor. "Doctor, I've been running from these memories for 3 decades. If I do not speak them now, they will die with me, and the galaxy will repeat the same mistakes." The recording devices hummed to life. Red lights indicated that everything Zethkar said would be preserved in the archive's quantum storage systems, available to historians and military analysts across the known galaxy. He stared at those lights for a long moment, knowing that once he began there would be no taking back the words. "State your name and rank for the record," Dr. Villana prompted gently. "Commander Zethkar of the Vorthic 3rd Battle Fleet, former liaison officer to the Human Colonial Marine Corps during the Kepler Sector War." His voice carried the weight of decades. "I served alongside human forces for 18 months during what the official records call humanity's introduction to galactic warfare." Dr. Villana leaned forward slightly. "The records show that human forces performed admirably during the conflict. Your reports at the time praised their courage and adaptability." "My reports were lies," Zethkar said bluntly. "Not deliberate falsehoods, but failures to capture the truth." "How do you describe something that challenges everything you believe about the nature of civilized warfare?" The Vorthic commander's eyes grew distant as he recalled those first encounters. The Galactic Defense Coalition was desperate. The hegemony had overrun 17 systems in 6 months. Their technology was superior, their numbers overwhelming. The Council was prepared to negotiate a surrender when the humans volunteered their military forces. He paused, flexing his scarred hands. "We were grateful but not optimistic. Humanity had only been part of galactic civilization for 40 years. Their homeworld Earth was classified as a death world by our standards. Most species considered them primitive survivors who had barely escaped their own planet's hostile environment." Dr. Villana nodded encouragingly. "What were your first impressions of human military personnel?" "Captain Jake Morrison and his unit from the 3rd Terran Marines arrived at our staging area on Centauri Station 3 days before the Battle of Zarian 7. Zethkar's voice took on a thoughtful tone. "I remember thinking how small they were. The average human male stood barely to my chest. Their equipment looked crude compared to Altarian energy weapons or Xanthari plasma systems." The commander shifted in his chair, his battle scars catching the light. "But there was something else. The other coalition species carried themselves like soldiers, professional and disciplined. The humans moved differently. They watched everything, analyzed every detail, as if they were constantly calculating threats and opportunities. Morrison was polite when we met, respectful of rank and protocol. His men followed orders without question. Standard military behavior. But when I looked into their eyes, I saw something that made my combat instincts stir. These were predators, pretending to be domesticated." Dr. Villana made notes on her datapad. "Did this concern you?" "It should have," Zethkar admitted, "but we needed every soldier we could get. The hegemony forces were massing for an assault on the Zarian system, and intelligence indicated they had developed new weapons that could crack planetary shields. If Zarian fell, they would have a clear path to the core worlds." The Vorthic warrior's voice grew quieter. "The plan was simple. My battalion would conduct reconnaissance on Zarian 7 while the main fleet engaged hegemony forces in orbit. We were supposed to identify landing zones and defensive positions, then withdraw before enemy ground forces arrived. Morrison's Marines were assigned to my unit as observers. The Coalition Command wanted to see how humans performed under actual combat conditions before committing larger forces. It seemed like a reasonable way to test their capabilities without risking major assets. Zethkar's laugh was bitter. We had no idea what we were unleashing. The transport flight to Zarian 7 had been routine. The human Marines sat quietly during the 6-hour journey, checking their equipment with methodical precision. Zethkar had been impressed by their preparation. Every weapon was clean, every piece of gear secured properly. They moved like veterans. Despite most of them being young by human standards, Sergeant Lisa Kane was Morrison's second in command, Zethkar continued. She could not have been more than 25 Earth years old, but she carried herself with absolute confidence. When I asked about her combat experience, she mentioned something called the Australian Desert Campaign and the Arctic Survival Training. I did not understand the significance at the time. The landing on Zarian 7 proceeded without incident. The planet was mostly desert with scattered mountain ranges and a few dead cities from a long-extinct civilization. Hegemony forces had not yet reached the surface, giving the reconnaissance team time to establish positions and gather intelligence. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan, Zethkar said. We mapped the terrain, identified strategic locations, and prepared detailed reports for Fleet Command. The humans worked efficiently, asking intelligent questions about enemy tactics and planetary defenses. But on the 3rd day, our orbital surveillance detected incoming hegemony troop transports. The enemy had moved faster than expected. Instead of having 6 days to complete reconnaissance, we had perhaps 6 hours before enemy forces would begin landing. Dr. Villana looked up from her notes. The official report states that your unit successfully evaded enemy forces and completed the mission objectives. The official report, Zethkar said slowly, does not mention what happened during our withdrawal to the extraction point. The Vorthek commander stood and walked to the chamber's single window, looking out at the peaceful gardens of Centauri. Prime, our convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles and 42 coalition soldiers. The route to the extraction point required traveling through a narrow canyon that intelligence had identified as secure. The ambush came without warning. Hegemony forces had positioned themselves on both sides of the canyon with heavy weapons and air support. In the first 30 seconds, we lost 1 vehicle and 8 soldiers. The remaining vehicles were immobilized by directed energy bursts. Zethkar turned back to face Dr. Villana. I had been in combat for 15 years. I knew when a situation was hopeless. We were outgunned, outnumbered, and trapped in a kill zone with no cover. The logical response was to surrender and hope for prisoner exchange later. But the humans did not see it that way. The recording chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of the archive equipment. Dr. Villana waited patiently as Zethkar gathered his thoughts, understanding that what came next would change everything she thought she knew about humanity's role in the war. Captain Morrison took one look at our tactical situation and started giving orders, Zethkar said finally. Not suggestions or requests for permission, orders, and every one of them sounded completely insane. Zethkar moved away from the window and sat back down heavily in his chair. The memories of that canyon ambush still haunted his dreams after 30 years. Dr. Villana remained silent, sensing that interrupting now would break the flow of the veterans' recollections. Morrison's first order was for his Marines to collect the bodies of our dead, Zethkar continued. I thought this was some kind of human burial ritual, perhaps a way to cope with the stress of imminent death. I was wrong. The Vorthek commander's 4 hands clenched into fists. Sergeant Kane started stripping equipment from the fallen soldiers, while Morrison examined the canyon walls through his weapon scope. The other Marines began pulling components from our damaged vehicles. When I asked what they were doing, Morrison looked at me with those cold human eyes and said they were gathering resources. Resources, Dr. Villana repeated quietly. I did not understand at first. We were trapped in a kill zone with enemy forces closing in from 3 directions. Our vehicles were destroyed, our communications jammed, and air support was impossible. due to hegemony fighters controlling the airspace. What resources could possibly matter in such a situation? Zethkar's voice took on a tone of reluctant admiration mixed with horror. Captain Morrison gathered his squad leaders around our largest vehicle's wreckage and began drawing diagrams in the sand. He was planning a counterattack. The recording equipment captured every word as Zethkar described the scene that had changed. His understanding of human nature forever. Morrison explained his strategy in calm, measured tones. He pointed to various positions on the canyon walls where hegemony forces had set up their weapons. Then he showed his Marines how they were going to kill every single enemy soldier in the canyon. Dr. Villana shifted uncomfortably. How could 12 Marines hope to defeat a force large enough to set up such an elaborate ambush? That was exactly what I asked, Zethkar replied. Morrison's answer was simple. He said humans did not think about defeating superior forces. They thought about making the enemy pay such a terrible price for victory that winning would feel like losing. The Vorthek? Veteran stood again and began pacing the small chamber. Sergeant Kane had finished cataloging their improvised resources. 4 pulse grenades from dead Zenthari soldiers, 3 power cells from the vehicle wreckage, a container of industrial lubricant, and something she called thermite strips that the Marines carried as standard equipment. Morrison assigned tasks to each Marine with the precision of a master craftsman. Private Danny Scott was 19 years old and looked like he should have been in school instead of a war zone. Morrison told him to use the dead bodies to create false firing positions while the real Marines moved to flanking positions. Zethkar stopped pacing and looked directly at Dr. Villana. Scott did not hesitate. He did not ask questions about the morality of using corpses as decoys. He simply nodded and began dragging bodies into position. When I expressed shock at this tactic, he looked confused and asked if my species had taboos about using available resources in combat. Available resources, the Altarian historian murmured, making notes on her datapad. Corporal Michelle Davis was assigned to create what Morrison called psychological pressure. She climbed to a position where enemy forces could see her clearly, then began shouting insults in the hegemony language. But these were not random taunts. She was describing in detail how she was going to kill specific enemy soldiers, using information she had somehow gathered just by observing their positions. The veteran's voice grew quieter. Dr. Villana, I have fought dozens of battles across the galaxy. I have seen warriors rage against the enemy, cry out in fury, or maintain stoic silence under fire. But I had never seen anyone speak about killing with such casual precision. Davis was not angry or afraid. She was simply explaining a process she was about to carry out. Zethkar returned to his chair, his massive frame seeming to shrink as he recalled the details. And the counterattack began exactly 8 minutes after. Morrison finished his briefing. The Marines moved with a coordination that seemed impossible for such a small unit. Every action had been planned, every movement calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact on the enemy. Scott's decoy positions drew hegemony fire while the real Marines used the canyon's natural acoustics to make their small force sound much larger. Davis continued her psychological assault, now describing the deaths of enemy soldiers she could not possibly see from her position. The hegemony forces began to panic, convinced they were facing a much larger human force. Dr. Villana looked up from her notes. How could she know details about enemy casualties if she could not see them? Morrison had positioned his other Marines to call out tactical information using human military codes that the hegemony translation systems could not interpret quickly enough. Davis was receiving real-time updates about every shot fired, every enemy soldier hit, every successful flanking maneuver. She turned this information into a narrative of inevitable doom that she broadcast across all communication frequencies. The Vorthek commander's voice carried a mixture of awe and revulsion. But the truly disturbing part was not the tactics themselves. It was how natural they seemed to the humans. They had not planned this strategy in advance. They had improvised it in minutes using only the resources available and their understanding of enemy psychology. Within 20 minutes, The hegemony forces were in full retreat despite having overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. They had suffered perhaps 30% casualties, while the humans had lost no additional soldiers after the initial ambush, but casualties were not why the enemy fled. Zethkar leaned forward, his scarred face reflecting the chamber's soft lighting. They fled because Morrison's Marines had demonstrated something that challenged the hegemony's understanding of civilized warfare. The humans had turned a hopeless defensive position into a psychological weapon that broke enemy morale through sheer brutality of imagination. When the canyon fell silent, I expected the Marines to celebrate their victory or tend to their wounded. Instead, they immediately began stripping equipment and weapons from enemy bodies. Morrison explained that they could not know when the next attack would come, so they needed to prepare for scenarios 2, 3, and 4. Dr. Villana set down her datapad. Scenarios? Captain Morrison had planned 12 different contingencies. During our 8-minute briefing, Zethkar explained, the canyon ambush was just scenario 1. He had already developed strategies for fighting in the open desert, defending fixed positions, conducting running battles, and even what he called a last stand protocol that involved turning our own equipment into improvised weapons. The recording chamber fell silent as both beings contemplated the implications. Dr. Villana had interviewed hundreds of veterans from dozens of species, but she had never heard anything like this testimony. The official records described human forces as brave and resourceful allies who had helped turn the tide of the war. They did not mention anything about the methods those forces had used. Commander, she said carefully, your reports at the time praised human tactical flexibility and combat effectiveness. Why did you not include these details? Zethkar's bitter laugh filled the chamber. Because I did not understand what I had witnessed. I thought the canyon battle was an anomaly, a desperate improvisation by young soldiers facing impossible odds. I believed that under normal circumstances, humans would fight like civilized beings following established rules of warfare. He stood once more and walked to the chamber's controls, dimming the lights slightly. It took 3 more battles before I realized the truth. The canyon ambush was not desperate improvisation. It was standard human military doctrine applied to a specific tactical situation. Morrison and his Marines had been trained to fight exactly the way they had fought. The psychological warfare, the use of corpses as tactical resources, the complete disregard for enemy morale and dignity, all of it was part of their normal combat procedures. Dr. Villana felt a chill despite the chamber's controlled temperature. What happened in those 3 battles? Zethkar turned back to face her, his expression grim. In those battles, I learned that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their numbers. It was their complete willingness to abandon any pretense of civilized behavior the moment such behavior became tactically disadvantageous. And that was just the beginning. The silence in the recording chamber stretched for several minutes as Zethkar gathered his thoughts. Dr. Villana could see the internal struggle playing out across the veteran's scarred features. Some memories were harder to share than others, and she sensed they were approaching testimony that would challenge everything the galactic community believed about their former human allies. The Battle of Crimson Valley began 6 weeks after the canyon incident, Zethkar said finally. By then, Morrison's Marines had been integrated into my battalion's standard operations. The Coalition Command had been impressed by their performance reports and wanted to see how they functioned in larger engagements. The Vorthik commander moved to the chamber's environmental controls and lowered the temperature several degrees. Crimson Valley was supposed to be a straightforward operation. Intelligence indicated that hegemony forces had established a supply depot in the valley's central plateau. Our mission was to conduct reconnaissance, call in orbital strikes, and withdraw before enemy reinforcements arrived. Dr. Villana noted the change in Zethkar's tone. Where his previous descriptions had carried notes of grudging admiration, now there was something closer to dread. The valley lived up to its name. Red rock formations created natural walls that rose 300 meters above the plateau floor. There were only 2 ways in or out, making it an ideal location for a supply depot, but also a perfect trap for attacking forces. Zethkar's 4 hands traced patterns in the air as he described the terrain. We established observation positions on the valley rim and confirmed intelligence reports. The hegemony had built a substantial facility with enough supplies to support their offensive operations for months. But something was wrong with the tactical picture. Wrong how? Dr. Villena asked. The depot was too lightly defended for such a valuable target. Our sensors detected perhaps 50 enemy soldiers and minimal air defenses. Either Hegemony Command had made a serious strategic error, or we were looking at bait for a much larger trap. The veteran's voice grew darker. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Murphy had arrived 2 days earlier with reinforcements from the 2nd Terran Regiment. Murphy was different from Morrison. Where the captain was coldly efficient, Murphy seemed almost casual about warfare. He spoke about combat operations the way other species might discuss routine maintenance tasks. Murphy called a planning session that included all senior officers from the coalition forces. I was required to attend as the Vorthak liaison. What I witnessed in that briefing changed my understanding of human nature forever. Zethkar stood and began pacing again, his movements reflecting the agitation of his memories. Murphy's tactical assessment was brutally simple. The depot was obviously a trap designed to lure coalition forces into the valley where they could be destroyed by hidden enemy forces. Any reasonable military commander would either call for massive orbital bombardment or withdraw and report the situation to Fleet Command. But Murphy was not reasonable by galactic standards. He was human. Dr. Villena set down her stylus, sensing that she was about to hear something that would require her full attention. Murphy outlined a plan that violated every principle of civilized warfare I had learned in 15 years of military service. Instead of avoiding the trap, he proposed to spring it deliberately while turning the valley into what he called a killing ground that would eliminate hegemony forces in the entire sector. The Vorthak commander stopped pacing and looked directly at the recording devices. The plan required using our own wounded soldiers as bait, deliberately triggering geological instabilities that would bury parts of the valley, and setting fire to the scrub vegetation that provided the only cover for ground forces. When I expressed concern about casualties among our own forces, Captain Amy Fisher explained the human perspective with terrifying clarity. She said that they were not there to survive the battle. They were there to ensure that the enemy could never again threaten coalition worlds. Zethkar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Dr. Villena. In that moment I realized that humans approached warfare from a fundamentally different philosophical basis than any other species I had encountered. For the Vorthak, battle is about proving strength and earning honor. For the Altarians, it is about defending civilization and maintaining order. For the Zenthari, warfare is a logical exercise in resource allocation and strategic positioning. But for humans, war is about survival. And a species that views war as survival will do absolutely anything necessary to ensure their own continued existence. The recording equipment captured every word as Zethkar described the implementation of Murphy's plan. The operation began before dawn on the 7th day. Human engineers had spent the previous night placing explosive charges at carefully calculated stress points in the valley walls. They had also prepared incendiary devices that could be triggered remotely to create controlled fires. Our wounded soldiers, those who could still move but not fight effectively, were positioned in locations where enemy forces would see them during the initial assault. The hegemony would naturally assume these were survivors from previous battles, making them ideal targets for capture and interrogation. Dr. Villena felt sick as she understood the implications. The humans were using their own injured comrades as live bait. But that was not the most disturbing part, Zethkar continued. The wounded soldiers volunteered for the assignment. When Sergeant Lisa Kane explained the risks, including the high probability of death or capture, every injured Marine immediately agreed to participate. The veteran's scarred face reflected a mixture of awe and horror. Private Danny Scott had taken shrapnel in his left leg during a skirmish 3 days earlier. He could barely walk, but he insisted on taking the most dangerous bait position because his injury would make him appear more vulnerable to enemy forces. The trap worked with horrifying efficiency. Hegemony reinforcements arrived exactly as Murphy had predicted, pouring into the valley through both access routes. They moved to capture the wounded Marines while establishing positions to ambush our main force. Zethkar's voice grew stronger as he described the battle's climax. Murphy waited until over 3,000 enemy soldiers had entered the valley. Then he gave the order that turned Crimson Valley into a tomb. The explosive charges detonated simultaneously, bringing down massive sections of the valley walls. The geological instability created an avalanche that buried the northern access route and half the supply depot. The incendiary devices ignited fires that spread faster than enemy forces could retreat. But the humans were not finished. While hegemony soldiers struggled with the chaos of falling rocks and spreading fires, human snipers began what they called selective targeting. They were not trying to kill as many enemies as possible. They were killing specific individuals whose deaths would create maximum psychological impact on survivors. Dr. Villana looked up from her notes with a troubled expression. How could they identify such targets in the middle of a battle? Morrison's Marines had been observing enemy forces for days through high-powered scopes, learning the social dynamics of hegemony military units. They knew which soldiers were leaders, which were technical specialists, and which were young recruits whose deaths would demoralize veteran soldiers. Zethkar sat back down, his massive frame seeming to deflate. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, fewer than 200 hegemony soldiers had escaped the valley. 3,000 enemy troops had been eliminated, along with enough supplies to support offensive operations for months. Coalition casualties were 68 dead and 92 wounded out of 400 soldiers engaged. By any measure, it was a complete victory achieved at acceptable cost. The recording chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of the archive equipment. Dr. Villana stared at her notes, struggling to process what she had heard. But the victory came with a price that none of us understood at the time, Zethkar said quietly. The humans had demonstrated that they were willing to sacrifice their own people and abandon every principle of civilized warfare to achieve tactical objectives. And they had enjoyed doing it. Dr. Villana had stopped taking notes. Her pale blue hands trembled slightly as she stared at the recording equipment, knowing that everything Zethkar said was being preserved for posterity. The implications of his testimony were becoming clearer with each revelation, and she was beginning to understand why this interview had been classified at the highest levels. "Commander," she said carefully, "your previous accounts described tactics that were brutal but still recognizable as military operations. What happened next?" Zethkar's expression grew darker. What happened next was that humanity stopped pretending to follow galactic conventions of warfare. 3 months after Crimson Valley, I was assigned to observe a special human unit that operated under protocols I had never encountered before. The Vorthik veteran stood and walked to the chamber's single window, looking out at the peaceful gardens of Centauri Prime. The unit was designated only as problem solvers. They wore no standard insignia, carried no identification, and reported directly to human high command through channels that bypassed all coalition oversight. Their commander was a man named Alex Foster who spoke 7 galactic languages fluently, and seemed to know more about alien biology than most xenobiologists. When I asked about his background, he simply said that humans had always been good at learning about potential threats. Dr. Villana felt a chill despite the controlled environment. What was this unit's mission? To end the war quickly by whatever means necessary, Zethkar replied without turning around. Foster explained their mandate with the same casual tone that other officers used to discuss supply requisitions. They were authorized to develop and deploy any weapons or tactics that would force immediate enemy surrender. The veteran's voice took on a hollow quality. I was required to sign documents absolving humanity of all responsibility for what I might witness while observing their operations. The forms were written in 17 different languages and covered scenarios I could not have imagined. Such As? Dr. Villana prompted, though part of her did not want to know the answer. Such as permanent psychological damage from exposure to classified human warfare concepts, such as species-wide trauma resulting from knowledge of human military capabilities, such as the possibility that I might develop what the documents called existential fear regarding the nature of human civilization. Zethkar turned back to face the recording devices. I signed the forms because I believed they were exaggerations designed to protect human military secrets. I was wrong. The chamber's lighting seemed to dim as the veteran began describing his time with the problem solvers. Their first project was analyzing hegemony, biology to identify weaknesses that could be exploited through targeted biological weapons. Dr. Helen Moore led this research with the same methodical approach that other scientists might use to study plant genetics. Dr. Moore had doctorates in biochemistry, xenobiology, and something she called applied psychology. She explained that humans had learned to study other species very carefully because understanding biology was essential for survival on their homeworld. Dr. Villana's stylus had stopped moving entirely. What did they discover? They discovered that every known sentient species had biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to create weapons of unprecedented precision. The hegemonies, silicon-based biology made them susceptible to specific mineral compounds that would slowly dissolve their neural pathways. The process would take weeks, during which affected individuals would experience progressive madness before death. Zethkar's voice remained steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. When I asked Dr. Moore if such weapons violated galactic conventions regarding biological warfare, she looked confused and asked which conventions I meant. When I cited the Galactic Accords on Humane Treatment of Prisoners and Civilians, she smiled and said that humans had never signed those accords. The second project involved developing what they called psychological weapons. Captain Chris Sullivan led a team of specialists who studied enemy communication intercepts to understand hegemony social structures and behavioral patterns. The veteran began pacing again, his movements reflecting growing agitation. Sullivan's team had identified specific fears and cultural taboos that were universal among hegemony subspecies. They were designing weapons that would exploit these psychological vulnerabilities to create permanent trauma in enemy populations. But the most disturbing project was something called Operation Damnation. I was not allowed to observe this research directly, but I overheard enough conversations to understand its purpose. Dr. Villana forced herself to ask, "What was Operation Damnation?" It was an attempt to create weapons that could induce genuine madness in any sentient species by exploiting universal neurological structures. Dr. Moore believed that all intelligent life shared certain basic neural pathways related to consciousness and self-awareness. If those pathways could be disrupted precisely, the result would be insanity that could not be treated or reversed. The recording chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of the archive equipment. Dr. Villana stared at her notes, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. "Commander," she said finally, "were these weapons ever used?" "No," Zethkar replied. "But not because humans developed moral objections to their use. The weapons were never deployed because their mere existence achieved the desired strategic effect." The Vorthek veteran sat back down, his massive frame seeming to shrink as he recalled the war's final phase. Foster's unit carefully leaked information about their research through intelligence channels. Not detailed technical specifications, but enough information to confirm that humanity possessed weapons of unprecedented horror. The psychological impact on enemy forces was immediate and devastating. Hegemony Command realized they were facing an opponent who could not only defeat them militarily, but could also subject their entire species to fates worse than death. Zethkar's voice grew quieter. Within 6 weeks of the first intelligence leaks, 3 major hegemony client species had switched sides. Their representatives claimed they could no longer support a war against an enemy who might use such weapons in retaliation. But the final blow came when Hegemony High Command received a detailed transmission from General Linda Torres. The message contained complete tactical assessments of every hegemony homeworld, including precise strike plans that would render those planets uninhabitable for silicon-based life while leaving them perfectly suitable for human colonization. Dr. Villana looked up from her notes. Was this a negotiation offer? No, Zethkar said bluntly. It was a promise of extinction. Torres explained that humanity had studied hegemony biology so thoroughly that they could eliminate the entire species while preserving the infrastructure and resources of their worlds for human use. The transmission included detailed biological profiles of hegemony leadership, indicating that humans had somehow obtained genetic samples from individuals who should have been impossible to reach. The message made it clear that humanity could target specific individuals anywhere in hegemony space. The veteran's scarred face reflected the chamber's soft lighting. Hegemony forces began withdrawing from contested systems within days of receiving that transmission. Their representatives requested immediate ceasefire negotiations through neutral channels. But humanity's response to the ceasefire request revealed the final truth about their nature. General Torres replied that humans were not interested in negotiations. The enemy had three choices: complete surrender, immediate withdrawal beyond the galactic rim, or total extinction. Zethkar stood and walked back to the window. The hegemony chose withdrawal. Their entire fleet disappeared beyond the rim within 6 months, abandoning centuries of territorial expansion and strategic planning. And that was when the rest of us realized what we had unleashed. Dr. Villana set down her stylus completely. What do you mean? I mean that we had allied ourselves with a species that approached warfare not as a political tool or a test of strength, but as a mechanism for species survival. And a species fighting for survival will do absolutely anything to ensure their continued existence. The recording chamber seemed to grow colder as Zethkar delivered his final observation about the problem solvers. The most terrifying part was not the weapons they had developed or the strategies they had implemented. The most terrifying part was that they had enjoyed the work. The recording chamber had grown noticeably colder during the long session. Dr. Villana adjusted the environmental controls while Zethkar stood motionless at the window, his reflection overlaying the peaceful gardens beyond. The Vorthak veterans. Massive shoulders seemed to carry the weight of 3 decades of silence. Commander, Dr. Villana said gently, you mentioned that the war ended with hegemony withdrawal. The official records state that humanity chose to explore new frontiers, beyond the galactic rim as a reward for their service. Was this accurate? Zethkar's bitter laugh filled the chamber. Dr. Villana, that is perhaps the greatest lie in galactic history. Humanity did not choose exile. We forced them to accept it. The veteran turned away from the window, his scarred face reflecting decades of guilt and fear. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Proxima Station. Every species in the coalition sent representatives to negotiate the peace terms and discuss post-war arrangements. It should have been a celebration of victory and cooperation. Instead, it became the most terrifying diplomatic gathering in galactic history. Dr. Villana felt her stomach tighten. What happened at the negotiations? Admiral Patricia Hayes represented humanity at the talks. She arrived with a small delegation and seemed prepared to discuss standard post-war issues like territorial adjustments, reparations, and ongoing security arrangements. Zethkar sat back down heavily in his chair. But the other coalition species had been meeting privately for weeks before the official negotiations began. We had all reached the same conclusion, independently, and none of us wanted to voice it directly. We were afraid of our allies. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Dr. Villana had interviewed hundreds of veterans, but she had never heard a warrior admit to fearing his own side. The Xanthari delegation presented their concerns first, Zethkar continued. Their logical analysis of human combat capabilities had led them to conclude that humanity represented a greater, long-term threat than the hegemony had ever posed. They recommended immediate restrictions on human military development and mandatory oversight of human research programs. The Altarian representatives agreed, though they phrased their concerns in more diplomatic terms. They spoke about the need for civilized species to maintain certain standards of conduct, even in warfare. They suggested that humanity required guidance to develop more appropriate approaches to conflict resolution. Zethkar's four hands clenched and unclenched as he recalled the scene. My own government had instructed me to support whatever measures would ensure that human military capabilities could never be turned against Vorthak worlds. We had studied the reports from the Problem Solvers Unit, and our strategic analysts had concluded that humanity could eliminate our entire species within a year if they chose to do so. Dr. Villana made notes despite her growing unease. How did Admiral Hayes respond to these concerns? She listened to every statement without interruption, asked clarifying questions about specific points, and took detailed notes. Her behavior was completely professional and courteous throughout the discussions. The veteran's voice grew quieter. Then she began her own presentation, and we realized that humanity had been preparing for this conversation since the war began. Hayes had brought data files containing complete strategic assessments of every coalition species. She knew our military capabilities, our economic weaknesses, our social structures, and our psychological vulnerabilities. She had studied us as thoroughly as the problem solvers had studied the hegemony. Zethkar stood and began pacing again, his movements reflecting the anxiety of those long-ago negotiations. The Admiral's presentation was titled Understanding Mutual Concerns. She explained that humans had anticipated coalition fears about their military capabilities and had developed what she called appropriate solutions to ensure galactic stability. Hayes outlined three possible post-war scenarios. The first involved humanity accepting a subordinate role in galactic affairs under coalition oversight. The second involved humanity maintaining equal status while accepting restrictions on their military development. The third scenario was what she called the independence option. Dr. Villana looked up from her notes. What was the independence option? Complete human withdrawal to unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim, with the understanding that future contact would be limited to specific diplomatic channels and trade agreements. The veteran stopped pacing and looked directly at the recording devices. Hayes presented each option with clinical precision, outlining the advantages and disadvantages for all parties involved. She made it clear that humanity was prepared to accept any of the three scenarios, but she wanted the coalition to understand the full implications of each choice. When the Xanthari representative asked what would happen if the coalition chose the first option, Hayes smiled and began describing human integration into galactic society. Zethkar's voice took on a tone of remembered horror. She explained that humans would naturally excel in any competitive environment due to their survival-oriented psychology. Within a generation, humans would dominate galactic commerce, politics, and military affairs not through conquest, but through superior adaptation and strategic thinking. Hayes showed us projected economic models demonstrating how human colonies would outcompete established worlds through more efficient resource utilization and technological innovation. She presented social analyses indicating that human cultural values would gradually replace traditional galactic norms through simple demographic pressure. Dr. Villana felt sick as she understood the implications. She was describing peaceful conquest through superiority. Exactly, Zethkar confirmed. Hayes made it clear that restricting human military capabilities would not address the fundamental issue. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their willingness to use extreme tactics. Their greatest weapon was their nature, as a species that had evolved to dominate any environment they encountered. The recording chamber fell silent as both beings contemplated the meaning of that revelation. Dr. Villana had spent years studying galactic history, but she was beginning to understand that the official records had omitted the most important details. What was the coalition's response? She asked finally. Unanimous support for the independence option, Zethkar replied immediately. Every species representative agreed that human withdrawal was the best solution for galactic stability and security. Hayes accepted our decision with grace and dignity. She thanked the coalition for our wartime cooperation and expressed hope for positive future relationships. Then she made a statement that has haunted my dreams for 30 years. The veterans. Scarred face reflected deep pain. She said that humans understood our concerns and respected our choice. But she wanted us to remember that humans knew where we lived, how we thought, and what we feared. They had proven they could defeat any opponent when necessary. The coalition should choose to remember humanity as friends rather than enemies. Zethkar walked back to the window and stared out at the gardens. Dr. Villana, I need to tell you why I have broken my silence after 3 decades and why this interview is not really for the historical archive. Dr. Villana's stylus stopped moving. What do you mean? I mean that you do not actually work for the Galactic Historical Archive. You work for the Crisis Management Division of the Galactic Council, and you need my testimony because another war is coming. The chamber's environmental systems seemed to struggle. Against a sudden chill, Dr. Villana stared at the veteran's reflection in the window, understanding that her carefully maintained cover had been penetrated. Enemy forces are approaching from outside the galaxy, Zethkar continued. Your intelligence services have detected ships using technology that makes hegemony weapons look primitive. The current coalition forces cannot hope to defeat this new threat using conventional tactics. You need humanity to save us again. The veteran turned back to face her, his expression grim. My own son serves in the Galactic Defense Force. His unit received deployment orders last week for border patrol duties that everyone knows are preparation for invasion defense. I will not let him die because the coalition was too proud to maintain honest relationships with our former allies. Dr. Villana set down her stylus and looked directly at Zethkar. What do you recommend? I recommend that you send me to the RIM territories as an unofficial ambassador. Someone needs to contact humanity and explain the situation. Someone needs to ask for their help, despite 30 years of deliberate separation. The Vorthik veteran's voice carried absolute conviction. But more importantly, someone needs to prepare the galaxy for the price humanity will demand for their protection. They will not fight for us out of friendship or shared values. They will fight because that is what humans do when faced with existential threats. And when this war is over, the galaxy will belong to humanity whether we want to admit it or not. Zethkar walked to the chamber's door and paused with his hand on the control panel. Dr. Villana, I have one final revelation that you need to understand before you make your recommendations to the Council. Humanity never really left. Their observation posts and early warning systems have been monitoring galactic space for 30 years. They know about the approaching enemy. They know.